Hey there, comrades. So, despite recent developments in the Ukraine conflict that are just reiterating the fact that Russia has the advantage and is winning this armed conflict against a Ukrainian military that's basically slowly falling apart and slowly on the retreat, a lot of people in the West, it looks like, as I've seen on the internet, and people in the Western media seem to have the same sort of confidence in the Ukrainian war effort that they had at the beginning of Russia's military operation in February of this year. And as a journalist following the whole conflict, it seems to me quite strange. And then I ran into this interview that CNN did with the current U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. He's at the G7 summit right now in Germany, and they asked him some pretty interesting questions about the Ukraine conflict. And what it communicated to me is that the West is already planning how they're going to frame this after Ukraine loses the conflict. And it should be a huge indication to you, whoever's watching this, the viewer of the media, the consumer of mass media, that things are not going well for Ukraine and you should not believe the Western narrative. So let's take a look.
There are a lot of things that you're focusing on here, but one of them is Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And Russia does appear to be edging closer to taking over all of the Luhansk region. Severodonetsk has fallen, apparently. And just overnight, many missiles were launched at Kyiv, including residential areas. Russia state media says the Russian defense minister just visited Russian troops in Ukraine. Is Russia winning?
Jake, let's not confuse the tactical with strategic. When it comes to Putin's strategic objectives, he's already failed. His strategic objective was to end Ukraine's sovereignty and independence, to erase it from the map, to subsume it in Russia. That has failed.
Okay, so right there, a lie. Russia's strategic objective was never to end the sovereignty of Ukraine. Nobody ever said that. Not Putin, not Peskov, not Lavrov. The Russian government has made its goals in this conflict and its reasons for why it got involved in the conflict very clear. Number one, to denazify Ukraine. There are a number of, there's a lot less now, but there were a huge number of armed neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine that exerted serious influence on the government and influenced what it did. If you want more details on that, you can check out our video on the Revolution Report. I'm going to put the link in the description. The second was the demilitarization of Ukraine, which is tied to the third reason of why it got involved in this conflict, and that is to maintain Ukraine's neutral status, to make sure that it does not become a part of NATO, because Russia is already surrounded by NATO states. NATO told Russia that it would not expand farther eastward, and yet here again we have a repeated step of Western imperialist expansion eastward that Russia just could not stomach this time. Now, in this interview, they did talk a little bit also about how Western sanctions were affecting Russia. So let's take a look at that part.
The G7 just announced a new ban on Russian gold imports. Right. The U.S. said that Western sanctions against Russia would devastate its economy, but that doesn't seem to be happening. The ruble is at its highest in years. Oil profits are soaring. When are these sanctions going to start having the effect that the West and President Biden has promised?
Oh, they're already having a dramatic effect. Well, first, let's take gold, the thing that we're just announcing. That is the second most lucrative export that Russia has after energy. It's about $19 billion a year. And most of that is within the G7 countries. So cutting that off, denying access to about $19 billion of revenues a year, that's significant. But beyond that, Jake, everything that we've done from the start in imposing these unprecedented sanctions and the export controls is having a profound impact on Russia. Even as it gets oil revenues with higher prices, it's unable to spend them because of the export controls. It can't acquire what it needs to modernize its defense sector, to modernize its technology, to modernize its energy exploration, which means that over time, each of these areas is going to go in decline. Already, we're seeing predictions that the Russian economy will shrink by 8 to 15% next year. The ruble's being propped up artificially at great expense. 1,000 companies, major international companies, have left Russia. They had products that were still on the shelf when they left, but those supplies have now dwindled. Russians were no longer being able to buy what they're used to buying. The standard of living for Russians is dropping. All of this is having an effect immediately, but it's also having a cumulative effect.
Okay, so there's several things I want to say about this. Number one, in terms of the oil revenue that Russia's lost in terms of declining sales to European Union countries and the United States, it's made it up and then some in terms of increased sales to India and China. And it's most likely going to do the same thing in terms of gold exports. And then in terms of natural gas, I mean, a number of European Union leaders have already said that they cannot actually survive without Russian gas. So it's really unlikely that that's actually going to have an effect on the Russian economy. And then I want to talk about what Antony Blinken said about the decreasing standard of living for Russians. I live in Russia, and I'm not bourgeois, obviously. I work as a journalist here. And I have to say, the only thing that has changed is that prices have increased a little bit, but nothing in comparison to what I've heard my parents talking about in the West, my friends talking about in the West, about these insane gas prices and skyrocketing prices for food. This is something that's just not happening here in Russia. And Antony Blinken talks a lot about predictions of effects on the Russian economy, but when we're going to see those predictions, my bet is never, really. Now, to make my point, I wanted to give you a visual representation using this open-sourced information map that you can find easily on Google. Just look up Ukraine conflict map and you'll find it very easily. Now, over here you can see where Severodonetsk was actually taken recently. This is where a huge amount of fighting has gone on, and this is basically the only pocket left of Ukrainian-occupied Lugansk that has not been liberated. And as you can see, the Russian forces are obviously planning to destroy this Ukrainian line here through a pincer movement. They're trying to surround them. And this is no doubt what they're trying to do as a whole as well. Once Russian and Lugansk and Donetsk forces have secured this area, that's no doubt what they're going to try to do to connect this line with that line, which would eventually lead to the almost complete liberation of Donbass. And once that's completed, Russia's actual strategic objectives will be accomplished. And mark my words, it's around those territorial borders that a peace treaty is going to be signed. And the West, Antony Blinken, the Biden administration, they're going to frame it as a Ukrainian victory because they're misleading people as to what Russia's actual strategic objective is, when in reality, Russia will have accomplished exactly what it set out to do. Denazify Ukraine as it's done in Azot and Azovstal, and protect the people of Donbass.